What if the stories we tell ourselves and others about who we are and who we are becoming aren't true? We for sure live in broken stories. We inhabit broken stories. But what if they aren't true? We understand our stories, our lives narratively. We know this, right? Like in the context of story. And we acquire these stories very early in life, pre-memory really they begin, as a way to find meaning and to make sense of our experiences, either real or perceived messages that we internalize and begin to believe about who we are in the world. And to make sense of what this place is like, right? And we organize our personalities too around these stories. They develop around these stories, these wounds. And so we carry these wounds, and these wounds become our stories. They're the stories we tell ourselves and others about who we are, or the stories that we hide, that we tell ourselves, you know. But really, they hold incredible influence over our thoughts and our feelings and our actions, and they distort the lens through which we see the world. The Enneagram helps us in a very primitive way, granted. It provides us the opportunity to take off the way we see the world and go, oh, wait a minute. Wow, that's the lens through which I see the world? Is it true? Is it true? Is it actually a clear depiction of reality? Or is it somehow or another bent? And if your worldview is bent, so is everything else. It's not just the individual stories that can be wrong. Our cultural stories are broken too. They are damaged narratives. There are stories like materialism. That's a story. If I have enough money or things, right, then life will make sense and be beautiful. Of course, materialism more broadly has a wider definition, but for our sake, I think that one works. I think nationalism is a story. Racism is a story, right? Exceptionalism is a story. Empire is a story, isn't it? Sexism is a story. And I could go on, of course. And the truth is, we are multi-storied people. Like there's not just one story storying its way through our lives. We have lots of stories, right? That we hear and believe from moment to moment, every single day. Now, some of those stories aren't bad. They're just lesser stories. And when you acquire one of these stories and make it the large dominant narrative of your life, then you are trapped in this constricted world. It's very important, and part of our sanctification, if you will, that we find the thread of our own story amid the cables and the knots and the networks of our broken stories. That's in part our task. And I think this is what Merton meant when he said, for me to become a saint means to become myself. It means to find our real story and become our true selves. For only our true selves bring glory to God. What is this thing, this journey? What is the summit of the Christian journey? It is to become yourself and to live a better story. Life is undemocratic. Some of us start life very, very broken. We are not consulted. Yeah. We are not consulted about the socioeconomic conditions we find ourselves in, about our genders, about our race, about our sexual orientations. I can go on, right? You are not consulted. I am not consulted. Some of us have steeper climbs than others in this life. And some of us have harder stories. It will be more difficult for us to find our true story, to inhabit a different story. But we can. But we can. And as long as these broken stories remain unconscious, they have complete autonomy over our lives. They run the show. They pull the strings. I mean, how many of you repeatedly ask yourself the question, again? Really, again? I'm doing it again. We find ourselves in these repetitions, these ruts of being, if you will, because if we don't bring these stories to conscious awareness, we end up not living our stories. Our stories start to live us. And that's not a good place to live. If we don't deal with them, then collectively, in the collective, in the aggregate, contribute to the continuance of the larger broken cultural narratives. We're not separate from each other. We are connected. Human beings are networked. And this is a new approach to the Enneagram, I have to say. Traditionally, of course, it's known as a personality typing system, right? But every time I would read these type descriptions and et cetera, I was just struck by, these are stories. These are narratives that people inhabit, around which personality forms. But I see them now principally as stories. This idea that, 9 stories, really? 7 billion people on the planet, 9 stories? Well, there's only 7 basic plots in literature. Maybe there's just 9 basic stories, of which there are an infinite number of expressions. I often refer to the Enneagram as the infinite variety of sameness. At the very least, these 9 stories appear so often in people's lives, we should at least stop to consider them. I'm very open to the idea that there's more, but here are 9 we see a lot. So let's stop and talk about them, I would also say that these broken stories are the reason that many of us around the age of 40 begin to wake up, if we're lucky, and begin to ask ourselves, why do I feel like I'm living in the wrong story? We call it a midlife crisis, right? But really, it's like the strategies of the old story begin to fall apart. They no longer help us get the esteem and the approval and the safety and the security and the mastery and control that are all basic needs met on our own terms, right? They just begin to fall apart. Yeah, we get divorced, our kids get, become addicts, or, we whatever it is, and our strategies no longer work to make sense or make meaning of what's happening to us. And we go, am I in the wrong story? Or as Carl Jung said, oftentimes we don't actually concoct our own story. They're thrust upon us. These stories are really given to us by family and culture, right, in all of its brokenness. And this is why, Jung was such a genius. He said, there's no worse thing that could happen to a child than for them to have to live the unlived lives of their parents. Right? You wake up one day and you realize, oh my gosh, this story I've been living is my father's or my mother's story. Their unlived story. Where's mine? And so, as I mentioned, in childhood, we adopt personality, a way of predictably and habitually acting, thinking, and feeling and seeing the world to help us just make meaning and sense of what's happening to us, of the traumas and the disruptions and the ruptures that we experience, as we grow up. And by the way, they're also there just to help us survive. I mean, we develop these adaptive stratagems to navigate the narrow straits of childhood. Remember, in childhood, you have no conscious awareness of God. It's the big people in the room, that we turn to get our basic needs met. So of course we're gonna concoct personas, presentations that will please the important people in our lives, though they may not even be who we are. It's just survival strategy. What happens is, because we live them from such an early age and continue to live them into adulthood, these stories, we lose connection with our true self. We lose connection with the true story of our lives. And we acquire these broken stories from our culture and our parents, and we become estranged from ourselves. And you can't be a true self in a false story. Only a false self in a false story. A true self can only live in a true story. Once you know your true story, and you continue to collude with the old story and the old wounds, the self-defining wounds, right? Maybe that's a definition of sin. Yeah? The willful collusion with an old story that's wrong, that's untrue. So I do believe that recovering our true story, our true selves, and daring to live them is in part what sanctification is. And it hangs on, that sanctification hangs on our shedding these false narratives and living our real story, our true story. What happens when I meet people who have learned the Enneagram is of course, the initial reaction is they're so, the fascination is deep and wide. I mean, because it does begin to explain patterns, and these type descriptions are uncannily accurate, and you go, no wonder, I'm a this, I'm a that. But you see, when someone says I'm a 4 or a 3 or a 2, you see, they don't understand the Enneagram. The Enneagram doesn't tell you who you are. It actually reveals to you who you are not. You are not a 4. You are not a 2. Those are describing personas and strategies that you adopted in childhood to survive, and no one rescinded the order, and you continue to live them. Isn't that powerful? I mean, I find it amazing to me, just the whole concept that what if the story isn't true? What if what I've been telling myself about who I am and the way the world is, what if it's not true? I mean, I think it reveals the ways in which our particular type's way of over-identifying who we are with it, this thing called personality, which really is was designed to be a protective mask, which is why, by the way, we should be very thankful for them. Don't prosecute yourself for having a false self. Don't prosecute yourself for having a personality that is in part an arcane script that is untrue. Don't blame yourself in some ways. This is a little bit of an overstatement, but don't blame yourself for living a lie. Really don't. Because actually in childhood, it helped you survive. When you let go of it, you should kiss it and thank it as you release it. Say, thank you. Thank you that you helped me. But now, in the afternoon of life, the strategies of the morning of life, thank you and goodbye. I don't think we grow spiritually, actually. I think we unfold. Growth seems to imply a linear kind of thing, but we unfold to ourselves and to the world. That seems to make more sense to me. So the gift of the Enneagram, of depth psychology, is that when we bring these stories to conscious awareness, we discover that we aren't prisoners like Hamlet, who I think resigned and accepted fate. This was fate. I can't get out of this story. We can rewrite it if we can see it. We must remember, right, Shakespeare's great line, no prison is more secure than the one you don't know you're in. So we find out the story. The Enneagram won't put you in a box. It's going to tell you about the box you're already in, the glass box you are already in that you cannot see, and then help you to get out of it. We're born originally vulnerable. Uncritical little minds that hear stories and messages that dissuade us of our beauty. I don't care what type you are. You doubt your beauty. And that's part of our condition. We're terrified of it. So I think we are originally vulnerable. And this is why I'm more drawn to the Christus Victor view of the cross. That Christ's death defeated the powers which has held humankind in their dominion. I guess the related ransom theory would be also a little bit closer in my thinking to the truth, that the work of Christ is first and foremost a victory over the powers which hold humankind in bondage. And perhaps by extension, I can say in bondage to these false narratives, these old stories, cultural and personal stories.